So I'm going to start off with a story. There's a Sufi tale I once heard about Moses on the peak of Mount Sinai, which is where the Ten Commandments were received. Moses started to feel really proud, basically, and hubristic for being the only one spoken to directly by Allah in this story. He says, "I'm special. Look at the hordes below. Allah has chosen me. I must be made of stronger stuff." So Moses thought he was the only one, a cut above. But then the creator and sustainer of the universe proceeded to reveal to Moses a mountain range of Mount Sinai's, each with their own Moses perched at the top. This talk is inspired by the increase in popularity of psychedelics these past 2 decades. And this revolution is certainly inspired by many things. From adrenaline junkiism, spiritual thrill-seeking, the desire to connect, the promise of extraordinary experiences. But one very real motivating factor, I think, is the ability for your average Joe to realize that he or she can be Moses on Mount Sinai. The belief that we can all be the guides of our spiritual destiny. No bad thing. Throughout my research as an undergrad and through my master's, I've been fascinated also by the ancient history of psychedelics. Their use among hunter-gatherers is well documented, and their sacramentality among syncretic groups also. But I've always wondered, and it's a niggling question of mine, why are they a scriptural fossil in the civilizations for whom they were once established in institutions? So there's the Soma of the Indian Aryans, the Homa of the Avestan Zoroastrians, and of course Matthew Clark has convincingly demonstrated through his exegesis that the Homa or Soma is likely to be an ayahuasca analogue, although other theories include the mushroom or the Amanita muscaria. But my question is, why was it gradually symbolized into a form of consciousness or into a god with a clear heritage as a ritual psychoactive? Why is this now lost to the mystery of history? Why do we have to figure this out again? And of course, there's Danny Nemu's research. He's talking next, but not on this, on the psychoactives among the Israelites, which were originally reserved for all of Israel, then gradually exclusivized to the priesthood, and then discontinued. What of the brew kaikion used in the Eleusinian mysteries? It's one thing to question what these things were. In the case of kaikion, was it psilocybin mushrooms traded from druids in the north, or was it an ergot barley rot, or whatever? But the other question is why these were discontinued in the first place. To me, that's a real mystery. Can we learn something from this? Now, this talk's not going to provide any answers. So I'm sorry for leading you down the rabbit hole, but it's an important and motivating problem. They were discontinued, and why? Hints at the real reasons can only be found, unless some piece of archaeological evidence with a kind of ancient Nixon comes to light, by looking at the present moment and at better recorded history. Can we learn anything from this? In my last Breaking Convention talk, I considered what an Orthodox Christian response might be to the idea that God can communicate to us using a chemical go-between. I concluded that the Orthodox would have reservations, Christicisms I called them, which ought to be heeded as warnings rather than as prohibitions. There is a risk that the icon or the transportative device can become an idol or a distraction. There is a risk that the drug becomes the end rather than the means and becomes deified. Bonhoeffer, not of Bonhoeffer syndrome, but the martyr who tried to kill Hitler, argued that the psychic or soul-based communities that promote altered states risk the raising up of charismatic others, whereas pneumatic or spirit-based communities promote inward transformation and outward sacrifice. Zehner, also a controversial figure in this world, very critical, argued that chemical mysticism requires less effort because it doesn't involve the gradual and worked-out training of the human psyche, as does a non-psychoactive but meditative intonation and regularity of religious ritual. Of course, neither of these Christicisms, as I call them, imply that it is theologically impermissible to use these chemicals to achieve mystical heights, but they do say proceed with caution. Now, in the interim, I've conducted a social study, the details of which can be found on my Beyond Psychedelics talk, but this talk now is going to be an anthropological theory talk, or philosophy of anthropology, I guess you could call it, which augments the other two talks and promotes the value of ritual as value generative. from a social scientific rather than a theological perspective. In a world of species chauvinism, ecological collapse, mass migration, the future can start to look very bleak, but out of all the academic discourses, aside from the rarely listened to theological discourse, the psychedelic world is the only place I find that has a real and exciting and much needed sense of hope for the world. But we must tread carefully. So I'm going to look at 3 anthropologists and use them to suggest how and why we must take rituals seriously. Firstly, I will consider Tipton's social study, Getting Saved from the Sixties, which I really recommend. Then I'm going to look on to Max Weber's essay on charisma and routinization to give us an understanding of cultural stress and spiritual gifts. And then finally, Rappaport's Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity will be considered. In our multicultural and postmodern world, religious ritual can look more and more like one of 2 things. A conservative thing to do that promotes hierarchy, or just doing the motions without any feeling or heart. In a word, ritual can seem quite boring, especially to high in openness hippies. So I will argue the rituals are actually quite the opposite. They can be radical, heart-centered, and deeply self-giving. Moreover, as Zaina has suggested, there is more to the regularity and mental discipline of regular ritual activity than meets the immediate eye. Following this, I will look at the end part of Chris Partridge's book, High Culture, and look at centripetal and centrifugal drug use, and look at the 2 ways in which entheogens are used, and propose a kind of division in that, a category division. So first, without further ado, Tipton's Getting Saved from the 60s. So Tipton's social study from California, Berkeley, in the 1980s, looked at what happened to many of the flower children in the 80s, and it turned out that many had either joined ethically or ritually stringent religious communities. They joined millenarian Christian sects, a Zen Buddhist temple, a human social potential training organization, so called Ehad Seminars Training. So he spent time with these ex-hippies to understand why, and came to the conclusion that they had gone to make moral sense of their lives. He assumed that the coherence of social life rests on the convictions we share about its moral meanings. There is a constellation of symbols, he says, which hold moral ideas together, and the 60s involved a crisis of culture. Please bear this in mind, this crisis of culture, when we talk about Weber later, concerning different styles rather than contents of ethical evaluation. So what are these different styles, I hear you cry? Tipton's qualitative analysis brought him to this. The youth of the 60s inherited from their parents a schizoid and contradictory style of ethical evaluation, deriving simultaneously from biblical authoritarianism and utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. So their solution was an expressivistic ethic, and let this kind of speak while I speak. Just take a look at that. So under the style of ethical evaluation known as authoritarianism, which includes the regular there, the act is right and wrong in itself based on biblical or legal or some kind of canonical authority. So you have a family, you stay loyal and contribute to the society in this way because this is the way it is decreed by God or by Marx or whatever. So under utilitarianism, by contrast, there is a cost-benefit. In the former you might ask, what does God want? Or what is the rule? What is the law? Then the latter you might consider first, what are my interests? So the only commonality between these styles of ethical evaluation is that they are universalizable. Everyone has the same standard of judgment. Okay? So for Luther, according to Tipton, all men are equal by virtue of their relation to the highest authority. For Hobbes, that is the utilitarian or consequentialist, all men are equal by virtue of their highest relation to the most basic drive of self-preservation. So one gives in order to get, or because one has already gotten, one doesn't give in order to give. So these 2 styles, the top 3 basically, were what the hippies' parents promoted in their children, and the new ethos of the flower children rebelled not so much against the parents' values as against the larger society's failure to enact the values in its public policy or bureaucratic structure. So the parents had a hypocrisy. They didn't enact the values that they espoused in the home when they went outside of the home to their jobs. So the solution for these hippies was an alternative ethic, an expressivistic ethic. So where the cardinal virtue is authenticity, opposed to the cost-benefit calculation of the utilitarian or blind rule following of the biblical ethicist, hippies radically attempted to redefine what was good. They rejected key elements of the good life of a middle-class society which were assumed to be ends good in themselves, nice job, nice car, nice house, critiquing the culture of their parents as disabling experiences of what is intrinsically valuable. They redefined it instead as love, self-awareness, intimacy with others. This new ethic relied on an intuitive, affectively centered self-awareness, an empathic feeling for others in a relaxed, non-analytical attention to the present moment. Sounds great, it is great, but there were problems, and these problems are the reasons that many hippies left the movement. Just quoting a couple of his informants, what we didn't count on was that everybody's personality was changing because of the drugs. So you'd start off knowing you all understand each other, then you start wondering, maybe you just think you know that person and he thinks he knows you and you know him, but it's all in your head, it's not real. I never forced anything on anybody. This is the other guy. I was considerate of the next person. If she didn't want to do it or he didn't want to talk about it, it was okay. It's funny, I thought it was free and easy, but actually it was hard a lot of the time because I cut people off. I didn't show my real feelings to them, and when they didn't feel the same way. So, by the way, just as a caveat, you should definitely read Acid Communism, because that talks about the positive sides of this, and obviously there were hippies who stayed hippies till kingdom comes, so this is just the dark side of what that ethic can reveal. And so what Tipton concluded was that this combination of ethic of impulse and situational appropriateness as a style of ethical evaluation, according to many ex-flower children, was that, although ideally self-expression replaced self-interest, mixed meanings make up the world in which the counterculture's individual lives, and a mixed moral logic governs her actions in it. One of the guiding assumptions of this talk one of the guiding assumptions of that talk is that the counterculture's own structural and moral fragility also contributed to its downfall. Because it relied on unregulated feelings to realize its values, it could not institutionalize them stably. Now, you might think I'm alone in adopting this more critical stance, but Timothy Leary himself spoke about this, calling the 60s a naive romantic time, excited by the notion that we humans could fly, cut loose from the synaptic cords that held us at low levels of mentation. We soared into uncharted realms of the brain, but we were on our own. Western psychological literature had almost no guides, no maps, no texts that even recognized the existence of altered states. We had no rituals, no traditions, or comforting routines to fall back on. In some sense, in some corners of the 60s counterculture, it was just the drugs. Now, when I spoke to William Leonard Pickard about this, he always says there are other factors here, like speed. Speed became a huge thing when acid was illegalized because acid's so difficult to synthesize. And so, of course, this is kind of one side of the story, and there is, of course, another side that we will hear at this conference, and that is also true and important. But it's also interesting to look at this and why so many people became disillusioned with it. So without further ado, let's go to this idea of charisma and routinization. So Weber wrote this essay, Charisma and Routinization. He argued that religious charisma arises during moments of cultural stress, either psychic, physical, economic, ethical, or religious, or political. And I think the 60s were pretty much all of those things. Individuals with religious charisma gain it not by being holders of a particular inherited status or office, like a priest, but by gifts of the body and spirit, which are believed to be supernatural. Weber says this can come from various factors. He was quite old-fashioned. He said maybe constitutional epilepsy. He believed the shamans were epileptics. Acute poisoning in the case of the Viking berserkers, he said. Now, of course, psychedelics most of the time aren't poison, but it could certainly, there's some wriggle room there. It's psychoactive. So this got me thinking. Charisma's authority is both specifically unstable and constantly being proved because codes and statutes are irrelevant to the cultural stress at the time. So it derives from personal revelation, basically. So my argument would be, as regards this, entheogen states, this entheogen state within an individual. If revelation becomes more accessible, we might say that the religious charisma or the decision-making, pattern-breaking power of individuals is increased. Such individuals have access to revelation, access to a place beyond and or anticipating the social cultural background. But, Weber continues, as revelation wanes and the new order is established to respond to that cultural stress, this necessarily crystallizes into enduring institutional forms through a process of routinization, becoming consistently rationalized, methodically trained with exact execution of the received order. So a submission under a disciplinary code not only maintains the status group and hierarchy, but stabilizes the shifting nature of the society, which was open to the charismatic impulse in the first place. Am I with you? So basically, charisma as a creative power recedes in the face of the lack of cultural stress, which then hardens into lasting institutions. For instance, the original narrative and cosmological revelations of the early Israelite priesthood, perhaps under the influence of a cocktail of chemicals, and spoken down through oral traditions, was frozen into the written scripture of the Hebrew Bible. The original Last Supper was institutionalized into the sacramental ritual of the Eucharist. My contention is that during the 60s, this charisma was not given the chance to crystallize. We know very well that this is due in part to the authoritarian and prohibitionist activities of the state. That is without a doubt. But it's worth considering the way in which psychedelics seem to act with an individualistic and hedonistic cultural milieu. Does it sound too sanctimonious to suggest it is both the authoritarianism at the top and the perceived ethical chaos from some beneath? One thing can be said, however, is that in instances where this natural cultural process is truncated and unmanifest, as I suggest was the case in the 60s, there may develop what can be considered by some within the culture some kind of ethical chaos. Could this, as Leary even suggested, be to do with the lack of ritual structure provided by hedonic drug use? This allows us to segue seamlessly into the next theorist in our pantheon here. Roy A. Rappaport's Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity. It's an amazing book. I honestly recommend it. Rappaport, in contrast to Maurice Bloch, doesn't see rituals as establishing hierarchy or a kind of diabolic smokescreen to distract you into obeying. He says that rituals aren't there to control behavior directly, but to establish conventional understandings, rules and norms in accordance with which everyday behavior is supposed to proceed. So, rituals cannot enforce values, as Maurice Bloch suggests, but they do define them. It is not rituals' office to ensure compliance, but to establish obligation. Let me give you an example. You're an atheist, you marry your husband or wife in a church. You still would think it's wrong to cheat on them if you underwent that ritual, even if you don't believe in God. That's the kind of thing he's getting at. So whilst the ritual's first office is performance, and this renders it the most basic social act, they nonetheless have morality intrinsic to them, relying more on acceptance than they do on belief. So cross-culturally, it can be said a breach of ritual obligation is universally stigmatized as immoral. We say that morals are completely relativistic, except for the fact that each culture has a right or wrong. But one thing that can be said is that when you've established something in a ritual, that kind of establishes an ought. To enact a ritual is to establish an ought against which the is of behavior may be judged. So in the context of this argument, entheogen states, and this is where we get to the difference, because you could smoke DMT in your room and meet God, but that might not be a ritual entheogen, that might just be an entheogen state. And this is kind of distinction that I'd like to see come into the discourse a little bit more. Entheogen states, without the cultural embedding of ritual entheogens, can become morally chaotic. Not always, they can become it, because as we shall see, they can dissolve as much as they create epistemic structures in your mind. They can dissolve what you think you know about the world as much as they can create it. So, as Barbara Meyerhoff said, every ritual has a physical and an ideological pole. And psychedelics are a perfect example of this, because you have something physical and it's engendering a spiritual experience, right? And when she says, when these poles fuse and single experiential reality is created and the individual becomes the embodiment of the collectivity's belief, their roots have been set down in the deepest layers of man's heart, of the heart, she says. Thus does duty become desire. So, a couple of authors on this. Lindsay and I at the Psychedelic Philosophy classes this year have been discussing these guys. Thomas Douglas has argued that, in principle it might be possible to neuro-hack your ethics by improving your motives. I would contend that rituals make that more likely. It doesn't mean that in a non-ritual context, it doesn't do that, by the way, just rituals make it more likely. And Brian Earp has also said it can improve our willpower to act on those motives. So I recommend you check those essays out. So, one useful distinction is made in the closing statements of Chris Partridge's book, High Culture. He explores the moment when the magic mushroom was discovered in the West and sees it as culturally indicative. When R. Gordon Wasson discovered the psilocybin mushroom in Mexico through his meeting with the syncretic Catholic mushroom shaman Maria Sabina, some of you may know the story, his motivation and method of ingestion fundamentally differed from hers. Sabina had used it for divination, to aid the community, to implot them on a narrative. It's like Georgia Gaia said, if you don't have a narrative, you don't exist. I found that quite funny. But it's true. But what Wasson did, conversely, is he used it first for experience, as a tool for transcendence for himself. The former, that is divination and healing, is understood centrifugally. Which I find this so fascinating. So it requires confirming others in the metaphysic and tradition of your culture, creating a culture for the community to cultivate and values to espouse. This is contrast to centripetally, in Gordon Wasson's case, where the focus of sacred labour is directed, and I'm partly quoting Chris Partridge here, inwards towards the self. When the focus is on the experiencing self, this is associated with detraditionalisation. And this is defined as developing concepts which are free-floating, detached from their original interpretative frameworks, and reinterpreted according to a range of other subjectively determined or cultural memes. That's quoting his page 334 of High Culture. I would now like to look at Terence McKenna. Another example here. When Humphrey Osmond, who gave mescaline to Huxley, figured out that it could be used for alcohol addiction, how did he do that? Well, in the really good History of Mescaline by Mike J, page 208, they went to a Native American ceremony to figure it out. Up until that point, they've been trying to simulate madness with mescaline, and then they realized it can be used for alcohol addiction, but only by going to a Native American ceremony to figure out that it's about giving out. As I said, centrifugally. So, here we go. The psychedelics are a red-hot social ethical issue, and this is archetypal individualist, wonderful man as well. Precisely because they are deconditioning agents, they will raise doubts if you are a Hasidic Jew, a Marxist anthropologist, or an altar boy, because their business is to dissolve belief systems. They do this very well, and they leave you with the raw datum of experience. Now, I'm going to do a classic social science thing, and I hate it when people do this, but that is a social construct, that idea of individualism that he's espousing there, that idea that I can define my own reality, and it's not really seen in indigenous or syncretic groups very much at all, where actually you are implotted into a narrative with others. And I'm not saying that going to the hills with your friends and tripping doesn't have ritualistic components. Indeed, probably often it might. And I'm not saying that will always make you a less good person. But I think rituals are quite important. So basically, could it? Just a few concluding statements. Do I have time for that? Yeah. Cool. So aside from the philosophical hermeneutical question of whether experience and interpretation can actually be separated at all, which will not concern us here, if we look at the wealth of studies on indigenous data, these rituals have the function of implotting individuals into a cultural narrative where they feel looked after, safe, they feel like they belong, they don't feel freed from their cultural constraints, like some kind of mad artist would want to be. So could this be the case that could it be the case, I'm only suggesting something here just for the sake of discussion, that the modern Western hedonic drug rituals that don't have a decorated portal, so you go to a rave, you bring however many pills and everyone's bringing different stuff and there's no decorated portal of entrance and exit. I mean, when I did my social study, I had heard experiences of people who had never felt, they had certain experiences at raves where they'd never felt more alone. And literally one of them said there were no elders to guide me. I was alone by the beach and I felt lost, this guy said, one of my informants. And that just really struck me as, of course, we hear about peace, love, unity, and interconnectedness, which are the kind of the creed of, if there is a creed, of rave culture. But a decorated portal of entrance and exit is more important than we think, because it establishes obligations, essentially. And it might sound sanctimonious, but I mean, I've met people who, obviously most people have incredible times at raves, but that decorated portal kind of ensures that the people don't get left out, basically. So Of course, it's true, as Julian Vane says, if an alien anthropologist came down to a rave, he would be thinking of it as a ritual, and it is a ritual, you're stomping to these beats, but they don't always have this decorated portal of entrance and exit that you see in syncretic religions and in indigenous use. It seems clear to me from all of this that the word entheogen has two distinct uses. An entheogen state, that is, when it occasions a mystical, numinous, spiritual, religious, phenomenal state. And distinct and not always concurrent with this, there are ritual entheogens, hyphenated, which are explicitly religious and ritual practices. So I would like to end with a statement of Rappaport's that really inspired me to consider the value of these rituals. Living men, apotheosized briefly as creative beings, men and women, sick, are themselves responsible for the world's creation and persistence. Given humanity's powers to construct and destroy, and its position of dominance in ecosystems that it itself can destabilize, its responsibility cannot be to itself alone, but must be to the world as a whole. Thank you very much.